Now. So this is just an overview of the general concepts of what a function is within JavaScript and the syntax that we use, and then some examples of how we can use either custom functions or built-in functions. So um, functions are an essential component to most programming languages, and the main concept is that it allows us to reuse code that does a specific task in a predefined unit or block, and then we can reference that code by its name and have it perform the tasks that we've already tested and written anytime that we ask it to. Or in some cases, that function might perform a loop that might call another function that does other things for us. So in this page, we're just going to look at some of the basic concepts here. So where do you find a function? You've really been using functions all along. Most everything that we do in JavaScript that includes a pair of round parentheses is a built-in function. And one caveat here says you're not using common built-in language structures for like loops or anything like that. So one common function would be like this, the replace function. So most of the built-in functions, we're going to use this dot notation like you see here. So in this example, we are going to manipulate this text string called myText, and we're going to put it inside of another variable called newString, and we will then replace one word and use another word in its spot. So in this function here, we are replacing string with the word sausage. So now it says, when we output this, I am a sausage. So if we want to reuse a function within arrays, there's a join function there that is built in. So if we have an array, a whole bunch of words here, and then it says take that array and join with a specific value, it's going to take each value in the array and put a space in between it. So it saves you some time having to concatenate everything together. Or a more popular common use of functions here is math random. So when we need a random number, we add this syntax here. So we use the math API that's also built into JavaScript. And then we use the dot random around parentheses, and that function generates a random number between 0 and up to, but not including 1. So we've been using functions a lot. All right, so under MDN's website, we go to References and Guides, we go to References, we can come down here to JavaScript, and then we can select Reference. And this page shows us the standard built-in objects or functions and methods and properties within JavaScript. So you can see here function properties. All of these ending with round parentheses, these are functions that we can use. They're built in. They do some tasks that have already been pre-programmed for us. And in most cases, we're going to pass some kind of a variable to them. There's also functions that we can use for text processing, numbers, dates, math. So for instance, if we take a look at math, and down the left, we can see all these, first off, different properties that are built in to the math function, and then additional mathematic logic that we can apply. So we looked a minute ago at random, so we can look at math random now, and it's going to return a floating point pseudo-random number 0 up to not 1, and we can get some kind of a value that we can use in our code to randomize things. So that's kind of our high-level view of the built-in functions. You'll see programmers talk about functions that are part of objects or methods. We don't need to know all the detail about JavaScript objects yet. We'll look at that in the coming weeks. But the main thing to know between a method versus a function is that so far the built-in code we've used is either a function or a method, and we can check this full list here like we just looked. But then there's a lot of custom functions. So functions defined in your own code, but not code that has been packaged with the browser. So anytime we see a function with some kind of a custom name like this, it's custom. It's handwritten. It's doing a specific task that isn't required by everybody, so it's not built into the browser. So this function looks like it draws some random circles, and we call this function, or sometimes it's called invoking. So we call this function by using its name. And when the parentheses are empty, that means it doesn't expect any kind of a parameter. So we just run draw, and it should go and run these lines of code. So instead of having to write all of that stuff out all the time, we can actually define our own function using built-in functions as well. So this function that's custom, it's called random, and it's different than this random method here. So random requires a number input, and then it's going to return, and its return is going to do some math that uses built-in functions. So it's going to take the math random function, multiply by whatever number you put in, and then it's going to round it down using the math.floor method as well. So in order to call that, we would just say random, put in a number, and then it should return what we expect. So we can try that here. And put this in. So once you define the function, it doesn't do anything. So it's going to return undefined. That's not an error. That's okay. So then when we say random, let's say 100, it's going to return a random number in and around 0 up to 100. So if I keep hitting random, I should get a different number pretty much every time I submit the request. So if I were to have just done math random, I just get a floating point, which means a decimal number like this, and each time I do that, I get a different number. And so that's why in the custom function that we just tried for our example, we multiply that by, let's say, 100. So now we get 3.78, and now we have to say, I want to round that down. So I'm going to take that same thing here, and now say math.floor. Actually, what I can do, I'm going to take this number and floor that like this. So if you see what happens down here, math floor 3.7 blah 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 turns into just 3 because it's taking it, rounding it down. So the next thing we can take a look at is how to call a function. This is probably the most common issue when people are learning how to use functions, is that they write all the logic and then nothing ever happens. So we always have to remember, outside of the curly braces of the function, to actually use the function's name and any parameters to get it to run. So this form of creating a function is called function declaration, and we'll talk about what hoisting means, but basically it means if I have this function at the bottom of my document in my JavaScript, and I have other functions above it and other custom code in between, hoisting means that if I use the function's name, it will bring it up to the surface and allow it to be executed. So next, anonymous functions. So anonymous functions are just a function, so it's going to do some kind of code inside of the brackets, but it's unnamed, which means it's kind of a one-time use. It's also not going to do anything by itself, and we generally use these with other features like an event handler. So in the following example here, we have a button that we're selecting on a page, and then we're saying on click of this button, run this little anonymous function. So it's just going to pop up an alert. So it's going to require that we already have a button on the page, and when we execute this, it's probably not going to work in the browser. So we'd have to have a page built that is prepared for that. So we can also assign anonymous functions to be the value of a variable. So you'll notice here we declared a variable and then we added an event listener for a click. Now in this one we're declaring a new variable and we're saying you are now equal to alert. So when I run this in the console, nothing happens till I call it. So when I say my greeting, it doesn't actually do anything. It just tells me what the function is doing inside of it. So if I try my greeting like this, now, because it's an anonymous function, when I add the round parentheses here, it knows to do something more than just tell me what the function is defined as. So now I get my pop-up alert for hello. So we invoke it that way, and like this says here, it's basically giving it a name when we add the curly or the round parentheses at the end. So it's kind of a matter of preference on how you do these things. Here's another one where now we're assigning the function to another variable, and we could invoke it with either method now. My greeting, which was the original, or now another greeting, but we have to make sure we're adding those round parentheses. But we really don't want to do that. It's pretty confusing. So it's really best to just define your function with a name and then call it as needed. But main thing we do want to be aware of is anonymous functions are going to be primarily assigned to our event listeners. So onClick would be our main one. So when we want to run some code, when somebody clicks on a specific element, this is how we will achieve that.